Did Thomas Jefferson own a copy of the Koran or Quran to better know his enemy, as he led the charge in a United States war on Islam? No, that's not true. Jefferson obtained his copy of Islam's Quran as a law student in 1765, which was 20 years before he began addressing the problem of North African Muslim raids on U.S. shipping. Historical records and Jefferson's own words reflect that he treated Muslim leaders and their faith with respect, and he saw the North African raids as economic, not religious. The claim that Jefferson was reading up on his enemy, rather than just seeking knowledge of world laws and history as a student, has spread on social media in the months since Jefferson's copy was used to swear Rep. Rashida Tlaib into Congress in January 2019. One recent example is a post shared on April 16, 2019 under the title, "The Real Reason Thomas Jefferson Owned a Copy of the Quran." It opened, quote, "A 232-year history of our fight against Islam and why it is no longer taught in our public schools." When Thomas Jefferson saw there was no negotiating with Muslims, he formed what is now the Marines, seagoing soldiers. These Marines were attached to U.S. merchant vessels. When the Muslims attacked U.S. merchant vessels, they were repulsed by armed soldiers, but there is more. The Marines followed the Muslims back to their villages and killed every man, woman, and child in the village. End quote. This is what social media users saw. The historically inaccurate post claims that America's founding fathers, led by Jefferson, fought against Islam from the start of the nation. Quote, "This is very interesting and a must-read piece of our history. It points out where we may be heading. Most Americans are unaware of the fact that over 200 years ago the United States had declared war on Islam, and Thomas Jefferson led the charge." End quote. The post claims Jefferson, who served as the first Secretary of State for President George Washington, and as the nation's second vice president with President John Adams and then as the third American president, saw Islam as a major threat to the United States. Quote, "His greatest fear was that someday this brand of Islam would return and pose an even greater threat to the United States." End quote. Interestingly, this post includes the cover image of a book titled Thomas Jefferson's Quran, Islam and the Founders, written by Denise A. Spellberg, an associate professor of history and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Texas at Austin. This seemed to imply that Spellberg's research supported the post, but lead stories learned differently when we contacted the professor. She called it Facebook garbage. Quote, "Jefferson's views of Islam, though mixed, encompassed the idea that Muslims would one day reside with equal civil rights in the United States. He said so explicitly when describing the intent of his famed Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which became law in 1786. Jefferson bought his Quran as a student of religion and law, decades before he considered any conflict with Muslims in North Africa. His record of interaction with Muslims and Islamic powers demonstrates that he treated these leaders and their faith with respect, defining the problem of North African raids as economic, not religious." End quote. Spellberg provided lead stories with a point-by-point debunking of the post, with direct quotes from Jefferson and footnotes for those who want to read more about it in her book. Quote, "Jefferson, as author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, referred to its inclusion of Muslims explicitly in his 1821 autobiography, stating that his legislation meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination." Thomas Jefferson's Quran, p. 119. End quote. Spellberg explained why the premise of the post, that Jefferson obtained the Quran to read up on his enemies, is false. Quote, "Thomas Jefferson bought his Quran in 1765, 11 years before he wrote the Declaration of Independence 1776, and 20 years before he considered the problem of North African Muslim raids on U.S. shipping." Thomas Jefferson's Quran, pp. 81–82. Jefferson was in his 20s and a law student at the time he purchased the Quran. He probably perceived the Quran as a book of law, as most Christians had since first encountering the Islamic sacred text. Throughout his life, Jefferson acquired numerous texts on Islamic languages, history and religion. Thomas Jefferson's Quran, p. 84. End quote. Spellberg gives context to the Muslim attacks on U.S. shipping. Quote, "Barbary pirates were called that by their enemies. In fact, in Europe and North Africa, one person's pirate was another's privateer.